This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. I'm an independent curator who specializes in prints and printmaking. You have found me at Series 3 of Platemark, in which I'm interviewing the wonderful people who occupy the print ecosystem. And that can range from artists all the way to gallerists, to scholars and curators. Today's guest is April Vollmer, who is an artist and teacher and author. She does it all. She wrote a book about and practices in her own work and teaches about the art of mokuhanga, which is something that I recently learned about. I mean, I knew about the thing itself, but I didn't know that that's what it was called. Mokuhanga refers to the fine, wonderful, and beautiful art of Japanese color woodblock printing. April's work is really interesting, and she practices this incredible procedure, which is non-toxic and easy to do at home because you don't need a press. So it's appealing for all of those reasons. I think you're going to enjoy our discussion. She's really interesting and has lots of great stuff to talk about. Let's see. Okay, housekeeping. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Any images that April and I talk about will be over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. Over there, you'll also find a support and donate button. You can help me keep the lights on over here. And there's also a little microphone you can hit and leave a 60-second voicemail for me. It could be a suggestion for who I should talk to next. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, I think that's it. Let's get rolling. April, it is so wonderful to see you. Thanks for coming on Platemark.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. First order of business, can you introduce yourself for the listeners?
Let's see. My name is April Vollmer, and I have a master's degree from Hunter College way back in the 80s. I specialize in Japanese woodcut. Well, first of all, I'm a printmaker. And from printmaking, I evolved into a specialty in Japanese woodcut.
I'm not even going to go. We have to wait to go into the details of where you started. But keep going.
And I developed an identity as Japanese woodcut specialist because I wrote a book about it in the, it was released in 2015. So that's what I'm known for. More than my art, really. It's for my publication, which includes my work, plus the work of about 50 other artists that I know who do Japanese woodcut now.
Yeah, I think by the end of the conversation, everyone will go buy the book because it's a great mix of the history of the form and also the how-to and the materials and, the paper and the specialization and how it's crossed into the West and crisscrosses back and forth. It's really wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I felt like that was what was missing. Like there's a lot of good technical books about mokuhanga. Moku means wood and hanga means printmaking. And in the West, we use it to specify the Japanese approach, which is water-based. But anyway, I felt like there was not, while there were technical books, there were not books about how it's used creatively by contemporary artists. And that was sort of the impetus for writing the book.
Yeah, I think I was flipping through it this morning and having all the images of your work, plus all of the others, including sort of traditional ukiyo-e. I can never say it.
Oh, yes.
Ukiyo-e. Yes, I did it. Ukiyo-e.
It's always inspiring. Those images are wonderful. And people don't realize that stuff was mold breaking. It was revolutionary. It was anti-autocratic. The Tokugawa shogunate was repressive, and those were the voice of the people. They were individualistic and popular prints, which I think sometimes gets lost.
Yeah, I think you're right.
In the cultural mix.
I think it's a wonderful parallel to Western prints as, the power of the people and multiplicity and, kind of spreading things far and wide. Like it just reinforces the idea of what prints are so great for, right?
It was the same in Japan, yeah. Which I think is somewhat overlooked when we look at those refined ukiyo-e prints from a different culture. They have a sort of mystical presence with the beautiful women, but you're not so aware of the cultural context
Yeah, I
of
think it's
a
easy to miss.
rapidly modernizing Japan, where people were becoming literate because of woodcut.
Is that right?
Yeah. It was all carved, all those letters, all the advertising, all the early modern. Initially, it was prayers, Buddhist prayers in the 8th century. But as time went on, woodcut was used for everything until, oh God, I don't know. I mean, I love the history, but I'm not really a historian. But yeah, it was the modernization of Japan was made possible by woodcut.
That's
And
incredible.
the specialists who could carve all the characters and the pictures.
And now the idea of carving the characters just makes sense.
I have a block from one of the sutras. I mean,
you
just
do?
whole blocks of little teeny characters. It's amazing what they could. But of course, that's all they did too. They would just carve all day.
Exactly. So that is one thing I think that held more firm in Japan for longer, the idea of the workshop and all the various roles. Can you describe that situation?
Well, the ukiyo-e prints were made, they were conceived of by a publisher. The publisher decided what would sell, and the size was predicated on the size of a piece of paper, what they could buy. And so usually they're a full-size sheet, half, third, quarter size sheets, but it would be not a print shop, but a publisher, a carver, a printer, and a bookstore too, and the paper store, and it was almost medieval or something. It was like all these small shops working together, so everything was a very high level of expertise. You didn't just make a tool, you would go to the baren maker. Well, the printers made barens too, I guess. But anyway, ukiyo-e printing was the product of a group of small specialized workshops working together, coordinated by a publisher.
Do you have a sense that the publisher always used, April as the cutter and Ann as the printer?
Oh, they would establish lifetime relationships. Yes, absolutely.
But they didn't all come into the same, you could have all of that in one workshop, you could have all of those roles. Well, right. That's right. Why not?
Oh, that's sociology. I don't know. But the relationships were lifelong and life-changing. Like if an artist could hook up with a publisher who was doing well, that meant he would do well. And if they broke up, and history is not, but like Utamaro fell out with his publisher and had terrible, these relationships were lifelong and life-sustaining. You had to have those strong connections.
Right. But now the artist by whom we know those works is the person who did the drawing, right?
Which is kind of arbitrary. And, well, it's very Western that the creative part is what we think of as the important part. But the quality of them, the beauty of them, the color, the paper, none of it would be possible without the input of all these technical helpers. And the artists would know that their carver, if they did this kind of scribble, it would be interpreted and clarified by the carver that they worked with regularly.
That's almost like the conventions that the reproductive printmakers would use in engraving. Red was this kind of a crisscross, and blue was this kind.
Yeah. And like
Funny.
I say, it's not really my expertise, but I do read about it, and it's fascinating to me how these and how different it was from what contemporary artists do today. And of course, Japan was not one thing. There are many artists, especially in early 20th century, who carved and printed their own blocks. There was a whole creative movement.
Well, right. Yeah, it evolves as one would expect it would, even though it's a place that is mired in this idea of the specific roles for specific parts of it. But it does come into a 20th century conception of artist carving and printing.
And those would be the Sosaku-hanga artists. And you don't see them around that much. I saw a few, oh God, what was his name? There were a few at this show I just saw in Wichita, but mostly what you see these days is the Shinhanga and the Yoshida family, and they're printing at kind of the same level as the ukiyo-e artists with very fine, careful carving and printing. The Sosaku-hanga carved and printed their own blocks, like Munakata, too. I mean,
Sure.
You can see his carving, very free.
Right. It's fascinating to me. Do you have a sense of when mokuhanga drifted into the West?
When I went to school in the 1980s, I came to New York to be an artist. I feel like that just isn't possible anymore, or maybe it's possible in some other way. But
where did you grow up?
I grew up in Rochester, New York, the north part of New York State. And I went to Hunter College, which was free at the time. Can you believe it? Anyway, I came to New York to learn art, and I became attracted to printmaking because I was sort of a methodical thinker. My family had science and engineering background, and I really liked the methodical steps of printmaking. It gave me a lot of space to think. So I started doing etching. I think my master's degree was mostly etching. And I did a few woodcuts. Like I said, this Vinnie Longo that I studied with always encouraged me to do woodcut. He had a fondness for woodcut. But people did primarily etching because you could work into it and layer things. So I did a lot of etching. And I said, Vinnie, what about Japanese woodcut? There's these great ukiyo-e prints. What's that about? And he said, I don't know. Different culture. It was not available then. You know, it was a specialty that maybe somebody did somewhere. And there were a few Japanese working in the U.S. at that time, but it was kind of specialized. And it was in 1995, after I'd graduated and been printing myself, that I found a New York artist, Bill Payden, who was giving classes. He was giving private classes for like, I don't know, $10 an hour. I think I paid, I don't know, I might have paid $300 for a 10-week series of private lessons. And each lesson was 3 hours. And he would talk to me. He would correct my carving. He would go on. He was obsessed with Japanese woodcut and really happy to find someone with some experience in printmaking who could then receive his teaching and understand what it was about. The tools. Oh my God. The Japanese tools are so much better than anything I had in grad school.
Oh.
And I'm like graduate school in New York City. They're much sharper and more specific, the tools, the Japanese tools, specific how to use them, which I liked. And then, let's see, the Kento registration he taught me. Oh, God.
Oh, yeah. Can you describe that? I was reading your book and I was like, I'm going to have to ask April to describe this registration.
It's just a little notch in the corner. I mean, it's genius. It's one of the special things that differentiates Japanese from Chinese woodcut, which is also water-based. It's just a little notch in the corner, a notch in this corner and on this side. You just fit the paper in, and the moisture attaches the paper on the surface, and then you rub it with the baren.
Here comes the baren, everybody. Do you make your own?
I got to get my baren. Well, you know what they look like, right?
I do, yeah. Actually, Aileen Feldman gave me one. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So it's just held like this, and you fit the paper into the notches, let it drop on the block, and rub the back of it with this tool. So I was like, oh my God, I can print at home. Because I'd graduated from school, I didn't have access to a press. There were a few small print shops in New York, Manhattan Graphics, Lower East Side Print Shop, and what's the third one? So there was some access to presses, but it was really great to be able to print at home.
Was Blackburn the third one, probably?
Blackburn was the third one, yeah.
Yeah.
Lower East Side Print Shop was in my neighborhood, so I did some work over there, some silkscreen printing and some carving, and they had great programs.
But the real reason to do the mokuhanga is because, let's describe the whole scenario. So you're carving blocks that may be big, but probably not huge. And you can do it in your home studio because you're using watercolors and you don't need a press. Like, it's all very self-contained, although you have
It's
lots of things in your
amazing.
studio.
Yeah, I couldn't
Yes,
believe it.
right. It's like
I couldn't
Eureka.
believe how simple it was. And, it was developed in Japan, which is very humid. And New York is less humid than Tokyo, believe it or not.
Believe it or not, right?
So you have to wrap things in plastic to maintain the humidity. And the payoff is that you have to be really careful about your materials. And mold is an issue with the paper. You have to keep it damp but not too damp. The paper's very expensive. The tools are really great, but really expensive, but they last a long time. So everything is a trade-off. And it took me a long time. I'm still learning. I would say I'm not a good printer. When I see a professional printer who's really good at it, I don't have the same control over things because I didn't learn until I was already an adult artist. And people who do it every day from the time they're kids are really good at it.
The person who's coming to mind when you say that is Yasu Shibata, and those tiny gradations of color on those very...
There are a few. Takachi Hamanaka, Yasu, even Keikohara is technically great, but Yasu is the most controlled. He's incredible.
That's what it looks like.
I had the
Pristine.
great pleasure of taking a short class with him. And supposedly I know this technique. I went to Japan in 2004. And it blew me away to see what it was like there. And when was it? It was like 2013, maybe. I took a class with Yasu Shibata. And again, every time there's so much more to learn.
Yeah, I think maybe it looks like a simple sort of procedure. You're self-contained and in your own studio.
Well, you can get something the first go around.
Sure.
People want to learn it in a weekend. And I'm like, well, I could show you a few things in a weekend. You could get a print, but to really control it, you need to spend the money on the paper especially.
Right.
The tools, the paper, and then just practice. You have to keep the tools maintained. You have to keep the humidity in the paper. But the advantage is you're very present. We talked about small studio, water base, easy cleanup. But also, while you're working, you're very focused with the carving and the printing. I find that mentally you're just so in the moment with the materials, whether you're carving or printing. It's not exactly meditative, but it's very focused. And I think that's something, printmaking is kind of that way, because you're dealing with materials and details of acid and, fine changes. But with Japanese woodcut, you're very in the moment.
I have two questions. One, in your book, you talked about the lack of sizing being part of the process of the paper making in Japan, of the washi, so that you were describing sizing your own paper, and I thought, God, that's a layer
that's
that
a part
I don't...
that I would change in the book. My Japanese friends tell me, it's so easy.
That doesn't look easy.
I took a class with Tetsuya. I always take a class with an expert when I have an opportunity. Going to Japan for the Nagasawa Art Park program was great. Going with the MeLab program was great. Studying with Bill Payton, studying with Tetsuya Noda. You know his work?
I do not.
Oh, he's wonderful. Very autobiographical, surprisingly, for a Japanese artist. And he was the head of printmaking at Tokyo Gaidai. So he's a big deal in Japan. Anyway, I took a short class with him at Columbia at the print shop there. What's it called?
Leroy Neiman.
And he's like, it's really easy to size paper. You want your paper to be slightly resistant. If the paper's too soft and absorbent, it'll just soak up the color and bleed out like it would for calligraphy. And you don't want that. You want it to stay where you put it. So you want it lightly sized. And he's like, oh, no problem at all. You just do this and this and this and mix this and soak that. And he did it. And I'm like, oh. And I tried to do it, and it's impossible. I can't. I mean, maybe if somebody showed me more slowly. So in the book, I tried to show people how I'd been told to do it, but I'm not at all convinced that's the best way to do it. You have to experiment. The amount of sizing in it makes it, it's more complicated than I had anticipated. So when possible, I try to buy paper that's already sized, or alternatively, you have paper that's old.
Oh.
Once the paper ages, and I have a lot of old paper because I don't use it up. I buy it because I love it. And then I keep it for 10 years. And you don't need to size it then.
Wait. What's the chemistry there?
You got to ask a paper expert. I mean, it's very complex chemistry.
Right. That's crazy.
The other thing I have to say about my early work in etching, I used a lot of black arches. And now that I'm going through and organizing my work, the black arches is totally brittle.
Oh, interesting.
And I had done I didn't really understand Japanese paper, but I'd done a few things on Japanese paper that I got a pearl paint. They're perfect.
Hey.
So I was like, oh, I should learn more about this paper. And when I went to Japan, I was invited to visit a couple of paper studios, which was another eye-opener.
Oh, for sure.
I would never use Western paper. Well, never say never. But I would always gravitate toward Japanese paper. It's wonderful stuff.
But there are American or your Western papers that are made with with mulberry or whatever fibers that are in that mode, not the same.
Well, there are Western paper makers who make paper in the Japanese way. What's his name in Idaho? There are a few, but that's Japanese technology. Kozo is Japanese technology.
Sure.
Inner bark of the mulberry tree is called kozo in Japan.
Right.
And they make paper with other fibers as well, but kozo is the one most commonly used for woodcut.
Right. And my second question is, can you do all of this stuff that you do with linoleum? And why not?
You can. I mean, you can do anything with anything, but why not use the stuff that's tried and true and works the best? And also it has some feeling. You know, linoleum is so, has no character. Mm-hmm. It's so, blech. And wood has a tactile satisfaction that you don't have with linoleum.
Do you ever use the grain to be elements in the compositions?
Not usually, but it often shows. The ukiyo-e guys usually tried not to show the grain because they, it was a business. And the publisher told them they wanted a picture of Mount Fuji, so they wanted to show Mount Fuji. They didn't want to show how it was made. They wanted the picture. But I find often it's visible in the flat areas in the background of a print. If you have a lot of action, it doesn't show. But if you have a big flat area, it'll often come through kind of subtly, which I like.
It's such a modern conception to look for that kind of signature, I mean, it's so funny.
Students want to show that. And I'm like, well, you could. And you can, wire brush it to get it to show. But I don't know, it's a wood grain. I mean, it's nice. It's fine.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with it.
It's just not anything, I want people to be creative and think of an image. My mind is very literal. So if you look at my work, I do tend to use, my training is, I studied with all these abstract artists. I love abstraction, but my mind is like, well, is it a flower or a bug so my abstraction grows out of this observation of nature, generally.
Right. Yeah. So tell everybody what you're putting into your work, what you're trying to say.
They're all quite autobiographical from different periods in my life. And it's much easier to talk about the technique than what the work is actually about, which is one of the reasons I like woodcut, like printmaking generally. You know, you approach your message obliquely through talking about the medium. Like I have an interest in cross-cultural understanding, but how do you say, oh yeah, Japanese culture is interesting, I like to make friends in Japan. If you have Japanese woodcut to talk about, you can talk about those transcultural issues, and you can talk about the environment. That's always a subtext to all my work, especially, well, recently I've been working on bird photographs, which is kind of not about woodcut, although you can make woodcuts from birds. But that's very much about the environment. I've been spending more time in Japan. A lot of my images come from California, where I was directly engaged with nature. But then my life is in the city of New York, where I have all this stimulation of art, and my travel to Europe and going to great museums and seeing all this wonderful art from historical art. I adore going to Rome and going to the museums. But when I come back to my own work, it kind of goes back to nature and my experience at the ocean and getting away from people.
Spoken like a true New Yorker.
Yeah, I do love New York, but I'm getting a little burned out sometimes. So I'm always grateful when I have an opportunity to go back to California and get away from people and just be in nature. I mean, it's almost a cliche, but it's very revitalizing.
I think people who haven't spent a lot of time in New York have never experienced this. But after college, I was in New York for a couple of years working at the Whitney on 75th and Madison, and I was on the West Side, so I would take the crosstown bus every day.
Oh,
and
fabulous!
You know,
I did that when I went to Hunter. I was on 101st and
right.
would take the bus across. Or I rode my bike.
Oh gosh, I didn't have a bike. But towards the end of my time in New York, you would be like butt to butt with people on the bus, and I just was like, if you touch me, I'm gonna, like, I knew it was time to leave the city, go get some green.
You need to get away.
It's a lot.
I mean, It's great, but it's very brain too, very brainy. Like I live in the front part of my brain way too much. You know, all this stimulation of going to museums and meeting friends to go to galleries and just constant challenges to understand things, to understand what abstraction is about. That was a challenge to me when I first came to New York, because that was what was happening. That was what I was seeing. And it was great. My brain grew a lot. And then at a certain point, you're like, oh, God, can I just go to the ocean and look at the birds? I mean,
yes.
This is decades. I've lived in New York since 1973 with just periodic trips to California or Europe for even a touch of European culture or Japanese culture. I started going to Japan in 2004. It's a wonderful place to visit.
Do you speak Japanese?
No.
No?
No.
Not necessarily.
No, does my husband. I'm married to a third-generation Japanese guy.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, he's born in New York. His mom was born in New York. And that's been interesting in understanding how persistent cultural presence is. I mean, we both consider ourselves New Yorkers. I mean, all our adult lives here. But the culture is still there. And we go to Japan together. It's very interesting. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I love the multiplicity of New York. But stretching to understand other cultures and other forms of art, other ways of working, is important to me as a person and as an artist.
But what's cool about using the Japanese method and style of not even style, like you've been given a kind of, set of materials and tools and way of working, but all's fair in love and war, right? Like the artists who are using those tools and that kind of style are all over the place, which is wonderfully illustrated in your book.
That's what I love. That's what I love about Japanese. I mean, you see the people in the book. You saw Keiko Hara's work. Oh my God. She knows how to print with the Baren, but you cut it up and paste it together and mix it with digital. The background of those was printed digitally, I found out.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she's incredibly free with her knowledge. The tricky part of that is I think it's valuable to know the technique well before you can be free with it. And I practiced it for maybe 10 years before I started doing these like rotations and I did some very regular flowers and standard prints before I started really playing around with it, before I'd learned the technique well enough to play with it. And I think that's what Keiko Hara is. And Yasu Shibata too. I mean, he can do anything with that technique. He's incredible. Who else is really good? Oh, Rebecca Salter. Do you know her work?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she's able to bring her kind of subtle abstraction into woodcut.
Right. Yeah. No, they're beautiful. And I would never have looked at them and imagined that they were done in that manner.
Well, she's worked with a traditional studio in Kyoto to produce some of her work, but she also cuts and prints her own blocks sometimes. An important part of what I do, my work and my idea and my teaching has come out of the residencies of Keiko Kadoda. And she was devoted to promoting Japanese woodblock in order to promote world understanding. I mean, it was pretty specific with her. And she invited artists from around, this is the 2004, the first time I went to Japan. She invited artists from the US, from Korea, from New Zealand, from all over the world to work together on Japanese woodcut. So that program ran for 11 years and changed into the MiLab program, which is outside Tokyo, which also promoted understanding Japanese woodcut by an international group. And then Keiko began a program called the International Mokuhanga Conference, which has been very important to me in making an international network of artists who do Japanese woodcut. Now, an international network is important to me as a way of understanding the world. And for some reason, linking that with Japanese woodcut has made it possible for me to stay in touch with artists from around the world because we share this interest in this particular corner of printmaking. So my life has been incredibly enriched by my association through the International Mokuhanga Conference with artists in Japan, in Finland, in Argentina, in Germany, around the world. It's quite astonishing the variety of people who've been coming to these conferences and that we've been able to stay in touch with.
Are the conferences like what we think of as conferences, week-long classes, talks, et cetera, et cetera?
I'm not sure how it's... Keiko Kadoda died in 2016. So that was a great loss. The program continues without her, but it's a little less fluid somehow. The last conference was supposed to be in Nara, but the pandemic kept Japan closed, even in 2021. It was supposed to be in 2020 when we would gather, but it ended up being in 2021, and then we couldn't really go anyway. Only a few, maybe 10 or 20 people who were already in Japan were able to go. It was an international conference with paper presentations and a couple of special exhibitions by small groups. And each one has been designed that way to have an academic portion and an international exhibition and additional meetings and demonstrations and satellite events. They've been big, but I probably should have started back when. The Nara one was the fourth one. The first one was in Kyoto, partially in Kyoto, and then we traveled to Awajishima, which was the location of the Nagasawa Art Park program that initiated this whole residency thing. The second one was in Tokyo at Tokyo Gaidai in association with Tokyo Gaidai, which is where Tetsuya Noda was head of printmaking. And he was an important supporter. Akira Kurosaki was a supporter in the Kyoto meeting, and he was head of Kyoto Seika. So there was always an association with the university. The third one was in Hawaii, the first one outside Japan, and it was wonderful, so great. Because it's halfway between the U.S. and Japan, so a lot of people could come. About 200 people came. And for me, it was a chance to see my friends from around the world. I did a lot of work helping organize the online organization. It's really run on a shoestring. But it was wonderful people coming together to share their experiences from different parts of the world, to share their information and enthusiasm for Japanese woodcut. Just a great thing and a really important part of my life as an artist. One of the reasons I've remained dedicated to Japanese woodcut.
Knowing how difficult it is to organize these things, having just come off of the second Baltimore Fine Art Print Fair, my mind goes directly to logistics. So if it's an international conference that's based in a Japanese art form, is everything presented in Japanese with interpreters?
It was really difficult each time, and essential to have a few bilingual speakers. And I think it worked for us because the participants were willing to go with the flow and have a good time. It ended up being wonderful every time, including the most recent one, which was in Nara, because the vice chair, Ralph Kidgel, took it on himself to organize all the papers that people gave, and they were all recorded in advance. It was kind of short notice, but we figured out that we couldn't travel to Japan like a couple months before we were supposed to meet. So he and Mara Cazzolino got together and uploaded things to a YouTube channel. And Mike Lyon, too. All three wonderful artists who are also wonderful organizers. And Ralph is the only one who spoke Japanese. He worked with the Japanese participants, including Keiko Kobayashi, Sato, and Katsu Yuasa, were on the Japan side, hanging the show and having visits to the, they went to sumi makers to see how sumi was made.
Oh,
very interesting.
Cool.
Thanks to a lot of hard work in Japan, and particularly these three people who were able to get it online, we were able to have a Zoom session. There were other people involved too, so that an international group over 3 days, we had a rotating conference. It was exhausting. And I tried to participate in 2 of the 3. We had 8 hours in Japan, 8 hours in Europe, and 8 hours in the US.
Oh my gosh.
Rotating?
Oh my
I can't believe it. It was amazing. But the benefit is that the entire conference that we presented is now online. We have a YouTube channel. So people who want to hear what people were talking about, and some of it was technical. We had some Japanese experts. We had some people talking about their own work, people talking about residencies, history. We had people from the Smithsonian speak. It was a really very great conference, in spite of the fact that at the last minute we couldn't go to Japan and meet in person. And that YouTube channel is, I think it's called International Mokuhanga YouTube channel. Right.
So my question for you is, if you're a young printmaker and you're interested in exploring this, like where would you send them to start investigating? To your book or to YouTube? Or?
Well, YouTube has a lot more than there used to be. My book is a good place to start. Tuula Moilanen from Finland has a really good book, technical book with more accurate technical information than my book has. And that's available from Maclean's. McLean's printmaking supplies. My book is more about why it's important and who's doing it and why it's fun. Tula has more technical information. There are a few places that it's taught, including, I think Frogman's now offers a short class. And everything at Anderson Ranch is top notch. I had the pleasure of teaching at Anderson Ranch twice. Wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And they sometimes have classes. Some universities have it, but it's really hard to get a whole semester devoted to something so specific.
Yeah, I was curious to see how many universities you could note in the book that have professors that teach this, because the school here, where I am often critiquing, there's nobody there that's teaching this at all.
No,
at Micah.
Well, Yunmi Nam teaches at University of Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
Katie Baldwin teaches at the University of Alabama, Huntsville.
Oh, Huntsville, okay.
So there are people who studied in Japan who are now teaching themselves. But see, now I'm talking about technique and stuff instead of talking about my own work, which is always how it ends up. But teaching is an important part of my process. I'll spend a lot of time in the studio, and then I'll want to talk about how it's done and communicate with people. And the conferences really give me a lot of enthusiasm for work. Like talking to Keiko Hara. It's like, oh, right. It's through your connection with other artists that you gain energy to pursue your work, which is why I love living in New York. Art is not something you do by yourself. It's a group effort. It's something that reflects your experience and the experience of your peers and your friends so that you can communicate.
Nicely said. I do want to get to your work, but I just want to mention for people who might be surprised to hear that I had never heard the term mokuhanga my entire career as a curator in an institution.
Ukiyo-e is the word people use, and Yasu Shibata uses that word to describe it all.
Oh, interesting.
But ukiyo-e means Prince of the Floating World.
Right.
And I feel like we're not in that world anymore. The floating world was the world of the Tokugawa shogunate, the Edo period, when artists worked in the workshop situation with small workshops collaborating that I spoke about earlier. We're not doing that anymore. So I like the idea of having a new word for it. I mean, we could call it sosakuhanga. You know, in Japan, there's shinhanga, the Yoshida expertise, and then there's sosakuhanga, cutting and printing your own blocks, which is closer to what contemporary artists might be doing. It was actually Bill Payton who insisted that mokuhanga was the word I should be using. So I've continued to use that word as a descriptor of water-based woodblock.
Okay.
It's just a word of convenience.
Sure. It's useful, though, I think. I mean, I'm sure that over my career, I had seen and cataloged and looked at plenty of things that were made in this manner, but never had a term to put on it. So I think it's useful.
I hate to call it ukiyo-e because it's so different from the 18th century, 18th, 19th century prints of the Edo period.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Although they continue to inspire me. Jeez.
Oh, they're gorgeous.
Some of them are very experimental too. You know, they had folding ones and toys and burned ones and one with chemical burn marks on them. I'm always astonished at what I find in the old prints.
Yeah, no, yes.
Although they tend to be small. They do tend to be small.
Yes.
So that you can control the moisture better.
Right. I love the ones with the big skeletons and the tattoos and all the kind of weird.
Kuniyoshi.
They're so great.
Kuniyoshi. The big spider.
Yeah.
Kuniyoshi. Yeah.
Yeah. There's some great ones there. All right. So let's talk about your work. So we're dealing with nature, but let's talk about this rotation thing that you're doing, which seems to be unusual in this mode.
I learned Japanese woodcut doing flowers. I like the patterns, the sort of mathematical underpinning of like a floral bouquet. It's 2 and 2 and 2 and 2, and then they get complicated, which is kind of the same idea of complexity being generated by repeating a block. One of my early prints was a mimosa, that yellow one.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the flower prints are based on understanding the mathematics, kind of the DNA of the mathematical genesis of plants. And as I became more fluent with Japanese woodcut, I decided to try out more things. There's also an issue with printing at scale. It's really hard to print large. So I thought by breaking it down into printing small areas, I could generate a big image through working closely with a small element. And that's what I started to do with some like insects. Actually, as I was getting more ambitious with my woodblocks, I also started to do some digital printing, which also started me thinking about moving things around. In Photoshop, you can move things from here and duplicate it and make 2, make 4, make 8, make 10, have it explode all over the place. So that started me thinking too. Those digital manipulations kind of fed back into my thinking about woodcut. And this was in the early 2000s when I had a pretty good grasp of Japanese woodcut and then a pretty good grasp of Photoshop. And I started working really big and challenging myself to do more woodcuts. Let's see, here's...
Oh, look, we're in the studio.
There's a big one.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Oh, that is big.
Now that's just 2 blocks.
Oh, wow. Oh, look, it's wafting in the breeze. Oh, that's beautiful.
Oh, yeah. That,
Nice.
Oh, God. That one is hung by 2 little magnets, 2 tiny magnets holding it at the top. I really like the way you can see the character of the paper floating like that.
Well, and it gives it a luminescence, too, when it's, it'd be great to be able to go all the way around the print just to be able to see what happens with the light coming through the paper and, the things on the back and here we go. We're traveling. Oh, gosh.
Well,
that's the chandelier.
It's a chandelier, yeah.
Gotcha.
And the paper went all the way through. And it's just filled with little magnets.
See, it doesn't have to be complicated, people.
Let me see. And this one is just 2.
Oh, those moths? Yeah.
Printed that way and printed that way.
Okay.
I think the yellow moth is different from the purple moth.
Yeah,
so
a little
it's
bit.
basically 2.
You have started
And then
reusing older blocks, too, and reviving them. And those are cool.
With those 3 are reused. Do you want to see work? Should I walk into the gallery?
You can. You've got a gallery? You didn't say that.
Ouch. I mean, my house. My house is filled with stuff.
Do you have a guest room, April?
I do. There's my blocks. I save all the blocks so I can reuse them.
Right.
Here's my flat files
studio.
that I'm up to the ceiling.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And here's my stairwell.
Oh, hey.
Which functions as a gallery.
This is a good solution, using every space you can in a building.
Well, I live in a small, as I explained earlier, we renovated this building in the 80s, which is really the only reason I can afford to live in Manhattan. But it's a tenement building. So I'm the only one who uses this hallway. So I've filled it with art.
Are you like a 6th floor walk up?
5th.
Oh, God. That'll keep your heart going.
So you can see how this one is 1 print in the middle and then the fern printed 4 times around to make it kind of breathe.
Is the attention to pattern, a way of linking the sort of perfection of nature in there's something about pattern, I think, that's very soothing to humans, the order.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It has to do with meditation a bit. It has to do with math, and it has to do with understanding abstraction too. Learning about abstraction was an important piece of what I learned coming to New York.
Well, so let's go to abstraction, because I have a hard time with pure abstraction.
It's never pure. It's always about something. That's the secret.
All right. Tell me your elevator speech on abstraction.
Oh, I don't know. I had such a hard time understanding it.
It's hard.
Yeah.
You can't there's nothing to grasp.
And then I started working with it and looking at it and reading. I just finished 10th Street Women.
Oh, I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. It's good. I mean, it's sort of a list of things, but it talks about the genesis of all those abstract expressionist paintings and how it's a response to World War II and the destruction of World War II. And Elegy to the Spanish Republic is about the war there. But all of them are about post-World War coming to terms with the new world after World War. But anyway.
No, I agree. Yes.
I have come to appreciate abstraction and working with the artists at Hunter, who were mostly minimalists. But then, Andy Warhol came and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool too.
But your prints, they're abstract in that they're not showing you the window on the world where the fern is growing, but they are things that we can understand visually.
They are. My mind is very literal. I need something to hold on to. Like that one that green one there.
Right.
That's a Seljuk carpet. I mean, once I start talking about them, they get very profound. The background, the purple, is a Seljuk carpet from the Middle East. And the wreath is it's supposed to be like a Dionysian wreath. I've been looking at, I went to Rome and I looked at all those crazy bacchantes dancing around. So it's a stem from a wild grape that I found and liked and drew. So I had this little carving of a grape, and then I kind of expanded it out into this sort of Dionysian grape leaf on the pad. So it's nature and culture coming together.
Gotcha. I think in the same way that those things are coming together is the idea of the mathematical order of nature being, math is a concept, right? It's an intellectual pursuit, right?
It's an abstraction.
And it's an abstraction. It's fantastic.
Like, the closer you look, the more you realize it's not a thing. And then the interconnections between things in the world, they're all interconnected. I mean, I don't know. I've been reading about the insect apocalypse and thinking, oh my God, that's why there aren't so many, and then there's a bird apocalypse. Well, birds eat those bugs. No wonder they're hungry. Understanding those interconnections are essential to the work. They're about the way things connect and breaking down what you see into pieces and putting it back together again. Whether I'm doing woodcut or digital I can't do that with painting. I want to take things apart to understand them. I did paint for a while. Okay. But with printmaking, you take it apart. It's almost like science where you analyze it really closely and pull it apart and then put it back together again to understand it deeply.
I like it.
And I think that's what I'm doing in a lot of these labor-intensive, oh my God. I mean, I look at them and I think, oh, I must have been crazy to do that. And then I think, no, I had to do that to satisfy myself. Take those old blocks, figure out what I was doing in 1990 with that picture of a cherry blossom and a picture of a bug, and I have to bring it back, mix it up, create a new context for it so I can understand it. It doesn't make sense.
Well, no, it does make sense. It makes perfect sense, April.
It makes sense for me.
That's right. It makes perfect sense because you tell me if I'm wrong, what you you're about in so many ways is our interconnectedness as human beings with relation to insects and birds and flowers, the earth, nature, it's all there. And you're using this mode that's traditionally Japanese, which is another intersection of cultures. So the conceptual rigor of the work is supported by the means with which you're making it.
Wow.
Bam!
You better keep doing it.
That's right. I'm going to keep being a curator. So you work in really small editions, probably because it's super labor intensive and you lose your interest once you've figured out what you're trying to say.
Once I've figured out what I've been trying to say, well, the one with the chandelier, I think there's 18. I had an assistant who helped me with that one. So that was, I'm like, I know that's a good image. I'm going to, and I think the green one, there might be 10 or 15. So I do try to settle down and make a few. But my real interest is figuring out the answer, figuring out what it's about, understanding how to put it together in a way that satisfies my intellectual curiosity. I look back at what I've done over the years. I'm organizing my studio now. Now that I'm home again, I'm organizing my studio and realizing, oh my God, I spent so much effort on this one or that one, and it's just in the drawer. I'm thinking that I need to get them out. But also, I didn't realize how much energy I had back then in the 90s and the teens, how much I was producing and how much I was pushing Japanese woodblock to make these things that are hard to make.
Are you working towards, I mean, forgive me for not having checked to see if you have a website where all of your prints are, but is there a place where people can go and find your work and buy it?
I mentioned Kentler International Drawing Space in Red Hook. Florence Neal has organized a flat file that has a lot of Japanese woodblock in it, contemporary. She likes to focus on that. She's an artist herself. And you can buy my work there. And at the Metropolitan Museum, let's see, what is it called? The gallery at the Metropolitan Store. I'm so grateful to them for carrying it.
Laura is a big champion of yours.
Oh, I'm so flattered because she knows what she's talking about. She's great. And Kentler is also a gallery I respect a great deal. It's a nonprofit space that promotes art, and they have a lot of programs for the neighborhood, for the community, and I just can't believe people work so hard to promote art. I'm so grateful to have spaces like those two galleries and others where artists can show and share work. It's really hard to do. Oh, and I haven't even mentioned my other show. I'm going to show some work at Zerker Gallery in the neighborhood, and that's an international gallery that has a program showing women artists.
When will that be?
With the Frieze Fair. It's in conjunction with the Frieze Fair, I think. It opens May 15th. It's the May 15th to 21st. And I'll just have a few works there. It's a large group show. Okay. But she's committed to showing, it seems like she shows a lot of work from the 80s and 90s, largely painting, but some prints. It's a really, really excellent gallery. I'm so pleased to be showing some work there.
Yeah, that's great. Listeners should know that we're recording this in mid-April and that you probably won't hear this until after that show is closed. I apologize, but I have some episodes stacked up ready to go.
I maintain on my website documentation for most of my shows and links to the information. So great. Even after the show closes, you'll be able to see photographs of it and the press release and so forth. And I document most of my work on the website. So you should be able to, you'll see a good range of work there. It needs an update, like all of us. Everything sort of fell by the wayside during COVID. So my website needs an update. But you can always see a lot of pictures there and links to the galleries where my work is showing.
Great.
Are you active? My writing. I have not said making work is primary. Participating and helping with these international conferences is really important. Teaching is really important. And I find that I reach even more people through writing. And I just published an article for California printmakers, but I've written for Printmaking Today and various other printmaking journals. And those are all listed on my website.
Okay. The one you just sent me that's in the California Printmakers one was just so touching. And it was about your dad who passed away recently and you're being with him in the end, which was just, it was a lovely story.
Oh, thank you. I felt like I was isolated during the pandemic. I was sort of more or less trapped in California with my dad, taking care of him during the pandemic. It made me feel like being an artist was a really important thing. It's not an easy way to make a living. I've always had multiple jobs and moving around. But during the pandemic, suddenly it occurred to me that I would be so desperate if I wasn't creative. Because during the pandemic, I got a camera. I didn't have a studio. I didn't have my art friends. I couldn't go to galleries. Nobody could go to museums. But I had a camera and I had the internet and Photoshop. And I did a whole series of photographs of birds. I would go for a walk. I would make sure my dad had his food. I would go for a walk to the ocean with my camera and photograph birds. It was so refreshing and kept me alive during that terrible time. It's so easy to forget how little we knew back then.
Oh,
we didn't know how it was spread or how long it was going to go on. Anyway, what grew out of that was my whole series of photographs of birds. And I worked with a studio in Spain, outside Barcelona, art print residents. Really wonderful people. Great residency program. Oh, they teach a mokuhanga class now.
Oh.
They paid very close attention, and they're promoting Japanese woodcut now there. It's outside Barcelona. Great. Really lovely program. So they, during the pandemic, they couldn't do their residency program. They made photo plates for me from the bird photos. I matched them with some other images. I mean, they're Photoshop generated birds and architectural renderings and different things that they then made photo etchings from and printed them. So beautiful. Made me fall in love with etching again to see these beautiful. They were printed by hand, hand wiped etching plates. So, I mean, I can't do etching anymore. I used to hand wipe plates myself, so I know what it's about. But to see someone else making these plates, it's a very small edition, but they just refreshed my memory of just how tactile and beautiful a simple etching can be. They're black and white on BFK. Yeah, that was a great project to keep me sustained during a difficult period.
Yeah, I always ask people that question about if the pandemic, lit a fire under you to try something new or kind of get your brain together, because it did that for me. And, everyone's answers are so interesting. Acknowledging privilege that we were able to not get sick, that we were able to get our vaccines, all
I told you I've had multiple jobs. My primary job for many years was working in an architectural office. And I had retired from that office work the year before the pandemic. I am so fortunate.
Yeah.
And my dad had saved money so I had helpers there.
Right.
So it was hard, but it was like, okay, I was in a fortunate position.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But I think what I love about you is that you are a great example of this idea that art, and specifically printmaking, because that's the zone we're in, it takes all of us. The tide will rise, all boats. You are a linchpin in this corner of the world. It's having its moment, I think.
Well, I think the Baltimore Print Fair seems to be putting things in perspective. I have seen so many rave reviews.
Thank you.
The print fairs are wonderful. opportunity for young artists too, to see a wide range of stuff. It's expensive to go to conferences, unfortunately. Print fairs are a little more accessible, maybe.
And you see more work, really.
Oh, you see so much work, yeah.
Right.
So the print fair is a really important part of the whole picture.
Yeah, no, I'm thrilled to have been able to bring it back, I have to say. And it's, I kept exhausted, but wandering around the fair just saying, this is my prom. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, well, like I said, the Japanese International Mokuhanga conferences were great, life-changing, but it's not something that just anyone could do. Fly to Japan and pay for a hotel, and it's not a funded opportunity, as great as it is. But there's a lot of information online, and take advantage of classes in the few places they're offered, and go to print fairs. There are more of them around.
There are. They are spotted around. There's one going on as we are recording this in Chicago. There's a bunch of people out there. Oh, yes,
I just saw that. That would be good, too.
Yeah. So there are things going on. We're all buzzing. April, it's been wonderful talking to you. I so appreciate you taking the time to speak with our listeners and giving us a tour of your studio. It's been really wonderful.
Oh, I don't feel like I was too organized about the tour, but at least you saw a few things. I can send you slides, or you can find them on my website. There's a lot of, I try to keep things updated on my website.
Right. Yeah.
Well, also, I'm very active on Facebook and increasingly Instagram. I find that a very useful way to stay in touch. And if there's an exhibition or a conference, I will post about that because I have a lot of Facebook viewers who are interested in those opportunities, and I'll always post those.
Okay, so we'll put all of these links and things that you should follow and read in the show notes over on platemarkpodcast.com.
Excellent. And then I'll put that on my website, and we can do all the networking things.
Wonderful. All right, we're going to sign off. Thank you again. I so appreciate it. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Platemark with my guest, April Vollmer. I'd love to send out a special thank you to her for being such a willing and engaging interviewee. You're seeing behind the curtain today, people. As always, I need to send a thank you to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music, and a shout out to Dan Fury of Extension Audio for helping me with the first round of mixing and leveling and editing. I super appreciate the help. Any images April and I talked about will be over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. You know that. And you can also do me a favor and hit the support and donate button. Help us keep the lights on. That's probably it. I think that's it. Let's have that be it. We will see you next time.